I thought I'd start by just giving some meta commentary on interdisciplinarity before we get into some technical details. So just to begin, to comment that I think the question of interdisciplinary research, it's actually quite clear from funders' perspectives and policymakers that interdisciplinary research is desirable. I think a mismatch, however, that happens often is actually at the implementation level at labs or universities, where reward structures in academia still tend to sort of follow along disciplinary lines. So even though we might, in theory, be convinced that interdisciplinary research is valuable, academics, especially early career academics, still nevertheless receive pretty mixed messages about whether it's advisable to follow an interdisciplinary career path. And so along those lines, I just wanted to share this great quote by Catherine Lyle from this book, Being an Interdisciplinary Academic. Our identities, our career progression as academics seem irrefutably bound to disciplines in the context of both our research and our teaching. This leads to the paradox of interdisciplinarity, where interdisciplinary research is often encouraged at the policy level, but poorly rewarded by funding instruments and academic structures. So some bigger picture thoughts on interdisciplinary work. But I just want to point out that our field, or at least my field in terms of data science and machine learning, is naturally quite interdisciplinary. So it sort of occupies this really unique space in the scientific world. The power of a new machine learning architecture, for instance, is often measured in terms of its generality, so its applicability across many different domains. So it's really no secret that staying at the cutting edge of at least machine learning in science requires both a deep disciplinary knowledge combined with a broad curiosity about how machine learning is being applied successfully in other disciplines. And if we don't maintain that curiosity, we really hold ourselves back in terms of being able to take advantage of some exciting new architectures. So the argument of my short talk today is that this is a real gift and we should take advantage of it, because not every academic has the advantage that we do by working in data science or machine learning. So I only have 10 minutes with you today, so I'm just going to give two quick examples in my work of some interdisciplinary applications of some of this research. So the first example that I'll give is an example of taking a method that was designed for particle physics and then applying it in the domain of astrophysics. So this technique is a method called KOALA. It stands for classification without labels. And the idea here is it's a very simple classifier that everyone in the room is probably familiar with. Except in this case, instead of having perfect access to labeled information, so which labels are signal and which labels are background, this method classifies between mixtures of samples. So it understands mixture 1 has some fraction of signal and background, and mixture 2 has another fraction of signal and background. But it doesn't know the exact fraction. But it turns out that we can exploit this fact that a classifier that is optimally designed to separate between these two mixtures of samples can actually give us some information about signal versus background on its own, even if it doesn't really have access to the labels within those mixtures. So we can think of this as a data-driven, model-agnostic bump hunting technique designed to find anomalies. So this was developed in the context of finding anomalies in LHC data, so finding new particles against a smoothly falling background. And if we train to distinguish between a signal region versus sideband regions, where the signal region contains more of that resonant anomalous signal, then the model will eventually pick up on some of these anomalous events. So it's a weakly supervised classifier. And what's exciting about this method is that a method that was designed originally to detect particle physics anomalies. So on the left, I show an example of from the original paper, where we can scan through a mass range of data at the LHC. And if no signal has been artificially injected into that data set, it detects no signal overall. But if there is a signal that's injected, depending on the percentage cut that you apply on that classifier, so the top X% of data that it's been labeled, you can eventually create a signal that's extremely significant. So it works very well to identify particle physics resonant anomalies, but it turns out some of my work that I'm developing right now is applying this to an astrophysics data set, so the Gaia data set. And it turns out that stellar streams, you can think of this as a resonant anomaly inside the Gaia data set. where it tends to be really localized in velocity space. So by scanning through velocity space, we can pick up anomalies in a very similar technique that we would use for particle physics. So just one application of some domains that are relatively, maybe relatively close, share some of the same interests. Second one that I'm going to give is a little more further afield. So this is some of my work. I've over the past, gosh, like 5 or 6 years now, I've worked across several different teams of researchers spanning academia and industry and the arts to construct some custom machine learning tools to analyze how I dance. So we've constructed some variational autoencoders and some graph neural networks to analyze my dance movements and generate new movements that look like me and also give me some analysis about how my body is moving. So you can see the whole motion capture setup here on the left, the motion capture room with 20 different cameras here on the bottom. And then on the far right, this is an example of a generated duet with myself, where the blue is a generated counterpoint to my real movements in black. So originally this was created kind of as a total side project to a lot of my work. But in fact, I found that it was extremely informative a couple of years later when I was developing a graph neural network model for identifying particles called pions at the LHC. So this data set of pions is not a time series like my dance data set, but nevertheless, each event in this data set was a single pion. So it was sort of a discrete body that consisted of around 50 points. Except in this case, those points didn't recognize or didn't represent points on my body. They represented points in our calorimeter in the Atlas detector at the LHC. So they just corresponded to energy deposits in our calorimeter. But my experience in understanding the graph connectivity of my body through graph neural networks was really helpful in building my intuition for how to construct the graph connectivity of this pion network. And I ended up using a lot of the same techniques in both cases. So I was really surprised to find that some of my work was applicable in this new domain too. And I show some results from this graph neural network model here on the right. So first is an example of just constructing a connectivity with k-nearest neighbors, as opposed to a fully connected graph or other types of graph connectivities that we tried. And then this plot here on the right shows the resolution, basically, of the predicted energy response of the pion. And we compare a couple different graph connectivities, basically a graph neural network with no edges versus a graph neural network with edges included, with access to a variety of different amounts of information. So the highest resolution curves correspond to graphs that have access to the least amount of information about the pions. And then as you add in more and more granular information, the resolution gets smaller and smaller. And it's nice to see how the different connectivities respond to that amount of information. And just to extend this metaphor a little bit further, I didn't participate on this paper, but I just thought it was interesting to note that one of these methods, this graph neural network that I designed, the purpose of this was to understand relationships between different parts of my body and understand how they were grouped and aligned. And this is really the same type of research question as was done with Miles and Shirley and a few others on this recent paper, rediscovering orbital mechanics with machine learning. So these problems are really not as distinct as you might imagine at first glance. Okay, so interdisciplinary research, I think, has the advantage of encouraging you to stay outside your comfort zone. You have to really understand your data from the inside and out. It's very humbling to try working on a new data set that you don't have much expertise in. One of my final points is that by working not only across disciplines within science, but also across creative disciplines, there's another nice advantage that you don't get necessarily with scientific data, which is that errors are not always bad. And I just wanted to end with this because I think it's a refreshing take to remember that there are some disciplines where you can have that freedom to really play in a true sandbox mode. And I think that allows you to be a little bit more adventurous in the types of models that you're working with. So, oops. Uh-oh. Here's an example of an error that's not always bad. Wow, this is dazzling. Well, I hope you can get a sense of just how insane some of these generated movements are behind the screen. Let's see if this one works. Okay, that's a little better. So sometimes these generated movements were like just completely hilarious and unphysical. And then sometimes I find these just very beautiful and kind of compelling to look at. This is like an undertrained graph neural network model. So just as an example that these working across different data sets can really allow you to be braver than you might normally be with a more regimented scientific data set. So to summarize, funding agencies often claim to want interdisciplinary research. Reward structures don't often back this up. I think this can and should change. But in the meantime, I think it would be great for us to recognize that we really do occupy a rarefied spot in this academic ladder by using interdisciplinary tools that benefit from STEM-specific resources. So I tend to believe that most people's curiosities don't arbitrarily stop at disciplinary borders. And it takes some bravery to stray from those boundaries, I think, but I hope this talk might encourage you to really rethink how broad your work can really be. Thanks. Happy to take any questions.
I can start maybe. So for the graph of the body, I mean, do you have node feature and edge feature, or is only node features?
I have node features and edge features. The edge features are, it's just a Boolean 0 or 1 if the edge belongs to what I define as my skeleton. So it's a little bit arbitrary, but I try to feed in some sort of skeletal information as edge attributes.
And then I wanted to ask you some, sorry. So when you have the generative model, the number of nodes is always the same, or you can have a
right. The number of nodes is fixed in this case, but I don't include most physical constraints. So a question I often get is, does the model know about gravity or friction or some of these other physical laws? And I really don't impose some of those. I had tried very early on to impose a penalty in the last term if the nodes sort of strayed too far from the actual construction of my skeleton. But this is something I found is that I wanted the weird outputs, right? So I ended up taking out that penalty.
Another question. I think Mark.
Just a general comment. I really loved your you're pushing for interdisciplinary approaches, but in reality, it's extremely hard, as you pointed out. So, because especially for young researchers that need to find a job, and they need to be well known in something they do, and it's super difficult to encourage them to say, okay, try this other thing, and when you really can take this risk, it's probably too late because so. I guess there's no answer for that, but I just wanted to know if you have any insight.
Yeah, the advice that I got from my PhD supervisor was to find a disciplinary home. And then from that sort of place of some security, then you can start to kind of play with those boundaries and stray a little bit more. I guess as a PhD student, I felt comfortable doing this. I also had peer-reviewed papers associated with that work. So that made it a little bit more palatable to be like, this is how I'm spending my time. And there are a lot of different journals and conferences to be publishing this work outside of just physics and machine learning. So I think that was one element. And the fact that it is using this interdisciplinary tool, I feel like that was really the key. But I think where I would struggle is if I were a dance major interested in working with machine learning, that disciplinary home has fewer resources and less, it's often viewed as less rigorous, even though of course it's not. But I think it's just, I benefited from being in a physics department, right? And then straying from that place. So I think we actually have more power than you might imagine by being in a STEM discipline.
I'm really glad that you brought up this rarity of this combination of STEM and ML. And I wonder if you think it's almost like a privilege, right? That a privileged position that we have access to both of these things. And I think especially at CCA, it's a huge advantage. Do you see the gap widening with time and there becomes more and more of this equity issue? Or do you think it's actually this access will just become prolific? I don't know, I'm just curious about your thoughts about where it's going.
See two different forces happening at the same time, and I can't tell which one is overtaking the other. I do think disciplinary rewards are becoming more and more disciplinary in the sciences often, but then you also see these new institutes or initiatives like data science institutes that are being created from the ground up that are explicitly about seeking input from many different sources. So I feel like some of these new foundations or new constructions might help to close that gap. But outside of these new things that are being created, I think the existing structures are kind of digging into disciplinary roots.
Yeah, I wanted to ask maybe more on the physics to astrophysics move. What is your experience with going to a new field or subfield and having to know the context of your work and understanding the language and all those kind of things, and what you're actually, why people are interested in the question that you're researching, and what things are important, like all the disciplinary things, I guess, that people in a discipline kind of know from years and years, but that are sometimes hard to get as an outsider.
Right, there's what you can read in a textbook about the problem, but then there's actually getting to know the researchers in the field and the political and the social context for these problems. I've totally experienced this over the past couple months. I mean, I joined the CCA in the fall, so I've tried to approach it with a lot of humility, and I think that helps people's guards not kind of flare up. That's something I'm really aware of, is not wanting to be seen as someone who's sauntering into a field that's existed for a long time and being like, well, I know how to use machine learning, so I can solve all your problems. So I think just you have to approach it with like a real curiosity and humility, and being able to just raise your hand and be like, I don't know what that abbreviation means. And I've tried to approach it by getting to know people first, instead of just commenting on a field without really being connected to it. But I think you have to build trust in the community first.
So I'm interested to know, like, when you go from the dancing movements to the other fields like particle physics, what do you actually apply? Like the learning that is being done in the dancing, you applying there, or like the actual architecture? What is specifically you transferring?
Yeah, in my case, I used a lot of the actual architecture that I built, data loader structures and ways of constructing the graph. And then what I mentioned in this slide is the sense of, there's a question in graph learning of how do you construct the graph itself? How do you design the relationships between these points? And of course, my particle physics data set is totally different from my dance data set. And so you still have to consider all this stuff from scratch, but I think it gave me a sense of intuition of whether the specific connectivity, like k-nearest neighbors or like physically motivated connectivity, whether that would actually matter in the long run in terms of the performance of the model. And it also gave me a sense of how the problem explodes when you try to do a fully connected graph where you're connecting every single edge to one another. So it just allowed me to encounter a lot of those early problems that maybe anybody working with a graph neural network would have faced, but in this data set that I was really motivated to work on, and I could make quick progress instead of working within the context of a collaboration.
Thank you. Yeah, we should maybe talk. I mean, in my experience, sometimes fully connected graph, they are not always the best thing. The pooling is usually what kills you.
Yeah, that's something I learned. Yeah.
Let's thank Mariel again. Thank you very much.